Hello and welcome back to Modern Education. I'm the host, Benjamin S. Woodford, back here on the Stanford campus, right underneath Memorial Auditorium at 90.1 KZSU Stanford. We are here in the basement of Memorial Auditorium, and I've got another guest with us this week. So I'm really excited to bring the guest on the mic and talk about everything he's got going on. First of all, for you, if you are on your commute home, you are tuned into 90.1 FM on your dial. You are also possibly streaming us online. We stream worldwide on kzsu.stanford.edu/live. And you can always text us or call in. The number here is 855-723-9010. We love to hear from our audience. You can also text that number, which we love even better, because then we can get your text and respond without having to stop all the action. And if you would like to get us on the Twitter, it's at KZSU or at KZSUDJ. We also love to hear from you there. We have a monitor right here in the station, so I can always see those tweets real time. If you got something to say about the show, please just tweet in as you're listening. We love to hear from our audience. So thank you again for joining me here on a Friday afternoon from 3 to 4 p.m. We're here every week to bring you some new topic related to educating or education. And today I'm really excited to bring my guest on the mic, Ryan Pryor. Ryan, say hello.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to give you your little bio real quick here. Ryan Pryor is a cross-platform associate producer in CNN's world headquarters in Atlanta. While he was attending the University of Georgia, he co-founded the Georgia Political Review and served as editor-in-chief and graduated Phi Beta Kappa from UGA with degrees in English and International Affairs. Ryan was also recently named to UGA's 40 under 40 list for 2018, which is pretty exciting, I'm sure, right? In 2017, Ryan interviewed entrepreneurs at the stock exchange for looking at top 50 companies in the world with founders under 26. He walked the campaign trail filming Jon Ossoff. Is that how I say that?
Jon Ossoff. Yeah.
Ossoff in the most expensive house race in history. He's a producer of Young People Who Rock video series, which highlights young idealists seeking to change the world, which is really cool. I'd like to talk about that a little bit. And Ryan has published stories for CNN Money, CNN Health, and CNN Tech. Prior to joining CNN, he directed, produced, and wrote a feature-length documentary called Forgotten Plague, which the Huffington Post called a must-see documentary. He's also written for the Daily Beast and USA Today. Let's just dive in right here, okay? I want to hear a little bit about your origin story. I know that's kind of a funny thing to say, but is there a story or a mentor or something that you think sort of really highlights how you started down this path of being a journalist and really trying to tell people's stories?
Well, first of all, yeah, my parents are from Oregon. My dad's from Oregon. My mom is from Texas, and I've been listening to they met in Okinawa in Japan. They were both working for the Department of Defense and for the Air Force. And so I have a kind of a either national or global background. And so we've moved all around the country and then around the world as I was growing up. And then I was in high school in central Georgia in a town called Warner Robins, which is next to Robins Air Force Base. And so that was the last base that we ended up at because my dad was a pilot. And I had a ninth grade English teacher named Mr. Daniel, Scott Daniel, and he really influenced me a lot to have a love of literature and a love of writing. And that was a pivot point, I think, in my life to discover that it was possible to write that well and to tap into the human experience so deeply. And from there, I became very deeply interested in literature and history, and so I studied English and International Affairs in college. And one of the best ways to merge both of those passions is through my work at CNN.
Right. Wow, that's great. And I love the point about the teacher being sort of a pivot point. Mm-hmm. I mean, in modern education, right, we always love when teachers have that kind of impact. And sometimes I think teachers don't necessarily get to hear the impact later on. Like your teacher, if he's listening to this, he's probably very thrilled to hear.
I want to make sure I tag him in Facebook.
One of his star students coming back and giving him some credit for that. I think a lot of teachers don't get that chance, even if they probably have done that for many, many students as they go through their
I think there's a lot of my high school teachers were much more influential to me than my college professors. So there's a handful of maybe teachers for AP Psychology and for Humanities and AP Economics. A lot of my AP courses I think were the most interesting. And another teacher I had was named Pam Stanescu, who was one of the really was one of the most revered teachers I think in the state of Georgia. And I had the privilege of having her for several different courses, and she spent lots of time with me after school when I was very sick. I had a chronic disease, and I was struggling to make it through my junior year in particular. And she was kind enough to tutor me day in and day out. It taught me U.S. history one-on-one when I didn't have the ability to go to school myself. And so the level of care that a lot of teachers put into really minting students is oftentimes goes unheard. But I felt like I was learning from one of the most brilliant people I ever met, and much more brilliant than a lot of people who have PhDs that I later interacted with.
Yeah, there's the heart of a teacher is something most people just don't even understand unless they've had one touch them, right?
Yeah.
It's powerful. So you were just here at Stanford, and you were speaking at the MedX conference, and the topic you were well, at least one of the topics you were speaking of is the power of narrative of illness. Now, this is sort of maybe a topic that people aren't necessarily able to quickly have a schema for understanding what that means. Could you just break down the topic first, and then we'll get into your connection to it?
So I was partnering with a friend of mine named Elizabeth Jameson, who's a extremely interesting person, who's a public attorney, and was very involved in the 1990s of sort of establishing the basis for what was going to be healthcare reform, Hillary Care at the time. And she's done a lot of really interesting work, partly in the political sphere, but really it's public interest law. She has multiple sclerosis. She's become quadriplegic, and she then became an artist and an activist and a writer after that, because she was wanting to kind of tell a deeper story about the human condition through disease, and showing that we're all should not be afraid of the imperfect body. That I have a disease, myalgic encephalomyelitis or chronic fatigue syndrome. She has multiple sclerosis, and we both have written about it in national publications. I've written about it for CNN, and she wrote about her disease in a disability column in the New York Times, which is was really well done. And I think that's what's so important to know about the kind of message that she's trying to put out there, is that illness will strike all of us at any time, or I should say frailty or infirmity in some capacity, or it will touch someone that you know. You can line up, I think, 10 people on the street, and someone's going to have bipolar disorder, someone else will have epilepsy, someone else will have autism, someone else will have asthma. So this is the human condition, and I think that what we were trying to do with this panel or with this workshop was to help free people up to talk about whatever type of vulnerability they have, and it might not be an illness, it might be a socioeconomic status or a sexual orientation or some other kind of thing that. But if you were able to tap into that sense of vulnerability, that's where I think some of your greatest power as an individual will come from. So I think it was important to both of us to write that, or to do that panel with everybody.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting, the two of you presenting this, because you have such different perspectives on a very, I'd say, the same type of concept, right? It's how other people's impressions or lack of understanding sort of interacts with your condition. And to have someone who has a quadriplegic, who is a very obvious disability, everyone can see it, there's no hiding it, there's no sidestepping it or pretending it's not there. And then yours, which you look healthy, and so you're coming from a place where people may not have even understanding or awareness or compassion that you have something affecting you at all, right? And I think there's something interesting there on both ends of it, because people don't necessarily know the struggle of having something going on that people can't see, and you have to either make it known to them or just decide whether or not you want to disclose.
Yeah, and I thought you made an interesting point that you would, when you spoke during the panel or in the workshop, and said that you'd rather be asked than have to tell. Yeah. And there's a burden on the person who's experiencing some form of suffering, that they have to reveal it, and that other people who are around them feel like they're not allowed to ask about it. But I think a lot of people want to be asked, despite the fact that other people are afraid to ask them. So that helping open up that conversation about what's okay to do is important, and more than likely you're not going to offend someone. And Elizabeth made a really great point when she said that she's quadriplegic and she knows that people are afraid to approach her in an airport or in a public setting, but she herself, when she sees blind people, she's afraid to go approach them. And she realized that through reading one of the other columns from that was published in the New York Times Disability page, that blind people were really wishing that people would actually come sit next to them and not feel like they were untouchables.
Right. And I think that's a universal fear of the unknown. I think is fair to put in that category. But yeah. I wonder where you think that fear comes from.
It's someone who's different from you, and I mean, I remember my first time seeing Elizabeth, and she has a really huge wheelchair, and I was a little bit nervous and intimidated by it, and you feel
because she could run your toes over.
No, I was afraid that she was different. I was afraid that her experience, her human experience, was different from mine, and that we couldn't really relate. And maybe you feel a little bit sorry for someone, and you have to figure out just understand that you don't need to feel sorry for them, and nobody really wants you to feel sorry for them, and so you're actually doing them a disservice by not approaching them because you feel sorry for them.
Right.
That's the wrong way to, I think, approach disabilities.
Yeah, and I think feeling for someone allows you to try to care about their story and want to know what it is, but feeling sorry for them is a way of distancing yourself, maybe, in a way of kind of keeping a divide where you see them as an us and them kind of scenario.
Yeah, I think, and then there's plenty of times when I've actively wished that people would not ask me about my condition at certain points, and so there's ways of trying to master the empathetic and tactful approach to letting people know that you're open. I think what I try to practice, I think, would be to let people know that I'm absolutely respect their privacy and their wish to maybe not tell me, but I want them to know that should they choose to tell me or reveal a certain aspect about themselves, I'm 100% there to listen.
Yeah, that's an important piece. I think just opening up the door, right? Mm-hmm. It's not tell me or else we're not friends, or tell me or else anything. It's if you feel like sharing, I would like to know. Mm-hmm. And I think that simple act on the person or curious, or the person feeling that they are different than someone maybe that looks different or acts different or has some different struggle. Mm-hmm. It's so important to just recognize your own curiosity for that, right?
Yeah, and in sort of there's a lot of really interesting things about what it's like to be blind, or what it's like to live in a wheelchair. One of my most interesting conversations at Medicine X a few years ago, and I regularly talk about this to friends when it comes up in conversation, was I was sitting across from a blind person, and I thought this was incredibly impressive that we were kind of sitting by the pool having dinner, and he would clap and he could tell me exactly where the pool was, where the tables were, where the bar was, based on being very sensitive to the sound that was coming back to him. And he was just telling me about there was a time when there was a fire, or all the lights went out in the building where he was, and so everybody else was scrambling for flashlights, and he had a pretty uncanny advantage over everybody else because he could navigate via sound.
Wow.
And that kind of thing is really interesting. And what I also really liked about him is that his dog was with him, and his dog had a Twitter page, and so I followed his guide dog on Twitter, and it's a very Silicon Valley thing to do, I guess. But
my dog has an Instagram, so I totally understand that. Yeah.
So it's funny to.
Yeah, so echolocation, right?
Whenever his dog likes my tweets, it's always nice. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm pretty sure it's him. That's like, I don't know. I have just
he's got a really smart.
I'm speculating.
His dog is really smart.
Well, those seeing eye dogs are like the Navy SEALs of dogs. I got to say, I have a service dog, and they're like the Army Rangers maybe, but they're not quite up at that level of the elite dog. So I don't know. I can't say. Maybe it is that smart. Yeah. So you've mentioned a couple times about your own illness, and It sounds like that started in high school for you.
Yeah, I was 17, and it's like October 22nd, 2006 is the day that I usually point to, and I came back from...
Is that diagnosis day? Or?
That for this disease, it's usually the onset is what people most know about, and then they know that their life has changed radically, potentially irrevocably, and they then have to embark on a journey toward diagnosis and figuring out what it is, and a lot of people... we're going to go through several misdiagnoses before they actually get to their...
Yeah, that can be a real struggle, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, when either your doctor is not knowledgeable enough or maybe your symptoms aren't presenting clear enough. Was that the case for you? Were you able to get a diagnosis right away, or was this a struggle that you went through?
Yeah, the 1994 definition of ME/CFS states that you should have 6 months of idiopathic chronic fatigue, and so that was kind of the going basis that we were navigating in 2006, 2007. There's since been more clear diagnostic criteria that would enable people to get diagnosed quite a bit sooner than 6 months, but it's particularly difficult because you're having to do a diagnosis of exclusion and getting rid of the possibility that the patient has cancer or brain tumor or HIV or multiple sclerosis or meningitis. And so you're screening out essentially every disease known to man, and then you can make the diagnosis with only because you've ruled out something, not because you actually know anything. But I think there's a much greater likelihood that we will have a blood test possibly available in all doctors' offices in the next 5 years. I would hope. That's a speculation, not a official thing.
Is this genetic?
There is a geneticist at Stanford named Ron Davis, who I know really well, and I'll visit him tomorrow. And I did a story about him for CNN a couple months ago, but he was one of the people who was a pioneer of the technology that fueled the Human Genome Project, and there's a story in the Atlantic that compared him to being an inventor of equally great consequence as Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. So what he did through inventing the technology that made the Human Genome Project possible was really nothing short of a revolution in science. And his son is severely ill, so he's become one of the foremost researchers in the field on chronic fatigue syndrome, is incredibly genuine and incredibly passionate. His contention is that he has created a way of testing and ruling out based purely on a blood test that can be done for very cheaply, and they just have to figure out how to scale it up and commercialize it. Okay,
so this is something he feels confident works now, and it's just a matter of getting it into regular practice.
Right, and I'll chat with him a little bit more tomorrow and kind of get an update on how that's going. But that's all through the Stanford Genome Technology Center, and that was the first time that I came to Stanford in 2013. Was we were filming him for our documentary Forgotten Plague, and that resulted in getting involved with Medicine X in 2014, and I've come back 5 times for Medicine X conferences. And I've also come back a few times for ME/CFS conferences. And Ron Davis is the one who organizes a lot of that stuff. So I think he's been a really interesting figure in the field.
Yeah, it's really, I think, powerful how parents and relatives of people that have injuries or illnesses or syndromes that really affect them become the champions for these things very often. And it is, I think, a lot of times born of necessity, but it becomes the fruit that helps so many other people along the way. And you see this, with mothers doing huge community projects to get their kids just access to school or different things. And it creates change for an entire community or an entire school district. And it's usually championed by someone who is just so fed up with their kid getting pushed to the side, or just not going to let this disease stop their kid from living or themselves. And it's a really powerful thing. I think that you were talking earlier about this connection, how you're either yourself or someone close to you will always eventually have some sort of ailment or illness that becomes available or prevalent in their lives. But I think it also serves to be this impetus for change that is pretty powerful and a really neat phenomenon.
In this particular case, it's as though this disease, ME/CFS, has messed with the wrong family. And when you mess with the level of intellect that Ron has and the level of the number of Nobel laureates that he's in touch with who will come to help him, there's a lot of potential for a pretty significant change.
Yeah, it's significant when when the right person is affected, because all of a sudden now there's money or knowledge, expertise that gets put behind it, and it's a powerful force of change.
Yeah, I think that he's a great intellect, but he's also a humble person. And I think that enables him to build coalitions better than someone who would be very ego driven.
Right. I'm thinking of Christopher Reeve and how much he did for spinal cord injuries, because Superman all of a sudden being quadriplegic, it was this huge thing that really created a lot of positive change and awareness and just spotlight on the topic as a point of discussion. And it's a similar thing, how he had the means and the notoriety and everything, and it really changed the conversation in a lot of ways.
There's one of the most famous people who has ME/CFS is Laura Hillenbrand, who wrote the book Seabiscuit, and she wrote the book Unbroken. So Unbroken came out several years ago as a film. I think it was directed by Angelina Jolie, and during each of the press interviews that she did with CBS and for a good number of other outlets, she was talking about chronic fatigue syndrome in addition to the actual movie. And it was interesting, I think, to the journalists, because they actually had a tough time interviewing her because she was not available a lot of the time, and she would say,
because she was tired.
She was sick, and she couldn't really make it to the studio, or had to have certain requirements, and so they had to find out about it that way. But she made a point to talk about it, and that was a very powerful moment when you're leveraging a major motion picture toward awareness for disease at the same time.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought this up, because it perfectly bridges to my next question. I was curious about your own managing of your symptoms, and you have your hands in so many things. You're doing movies and screenplays and so many things that you're building and creating and producing and writing. How do you manage it all, and how has this changed, or how do you? I mean, I know you started when you were pretty young, but how do you think this has changed the way you approach using your time and your energy? And are there maybe lessons other people can learn from the way you've learned to manage your own output? Yeah,
I guess that I've actually probably learned to, first of all, to pace myself a lot better than most people who are probably in their teens and 20s. That they think they're invincible. They think they can stay out till 3 a.m. and wake back up at 6 a.m. or 7 a.m. and do okay, and they can be super ambitious and not take care of their body, or they can abuse themselves, and or they can also afford to have reckless ambition and not take into account their family or the people around them.
Right.
And people learn those lessons the hard way years later if it catches back up to them. But I learned to pace myself and to be extremely sensitive to how I was feeling from the age of 17. I think that's one of the most useful lessons that this disease has taught me. And I think that as soon as life really humbles you in a really, really deep way, you kind of embark on your second life. And I was reading this theologian, Richard Rohr, who talks a lot about this. And once you are transformed by your suffering, then you actually can live a much deeper and more authentic life.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think I've seen this in so many different people's lives where they face real hardship or real loss or real pain beyond just, a breakup or losing your house or something. And it changes you forever. And there's a level, I think, of empathy and understanding and just depth of willingness to empathize that is almost impossible to shake once you have it. And it really is pretty transformative in the way people see each other and how they relate to each other and what is important.
Yeah, I think that I really like what Richard Rohr wrote, where he says that that heaven is, or hell is not the opposite of heaven. Hell can be the pathway to heaven. You won't really live the best life possible until you've suffered greatly. And another way of putting it is, religion is for people who are afraid of, or religion is for people who are afraid of hell, and spirituality is for people who've been through hell.
Oh, wow.
And once you can develop a much, less judgmental attitude toward yourself and toward people around you, you're going to actually unlock the potential for much greater things.
Yeah. Now that's great to think about that and go on to talk about the way you approach narratives. So you put I think a lot of chips in the basket of using narrative to try to convey these messages and these experiences to other people. why do you think that's the way, or what is the power in narratives to be able to help create understanding or empathy or change?
It's quite a bit more interesting to read a book or watch a movie where there's a beginning, middle, and end, and it's a specific thing happening to a specific person. You could easily write a textbook, and it's not particularly interesting. But if it's a memoir, it's just dramatically more interesting. And
Okay.
I think the human brain is. There's probably neuroscientists who can talk more about this, but the human brain is geared toward narrative, and it makes it the easiest way to remember something. And there's a lot of research done on the nature of memory, and people who are entering these memory competitions who are champions at.
They remember through story, right?
Yes, they create really absurd stories, or they build these sort of strange kind of progressions in their head, and they connect a concept to a particular thing that they're trying to memorize, and they make it lodge in their brain better, and so that's neurologically we thrive on stories that way.
Okay, so your approach then is practical. You want people to remember these stories. You want them to stick, and that's why you're focusing on telling people stories that way.
I think. Well, yeah, I don't think there's any kind of cynical motive there, or there's any kind of like neurological like rationale. I think it's just like, if you want to be empathetic, if you want to be interesting, then if I want to keep myself interested in the kind of work, you want to tell stories where there's kind of these epic ups and downs and dramatic twists and turns, and those are the most fun for me to write, and I think readers respond to it.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about looking at how you choose who the stories you're going to tell are. Mm-hmm. How do you go about that? Do you have a process? Is it they just kind of fall in your lap?
A lot of the stories that I would be most, oftentimes if I have a list of, let's say, 10 or 12 ideas that I have for stories I want to pitch, and I'll pick the first 2 or 3, and I don't really have time to write all of them or pitch all of them or really sort of champion all these when I'm at work. But the ideas that really latch, that you cannot live without, I think it's really if you cannot bear to live in a world where this story is not being told, or where this product is not being sold, those are the kind of things that you need to do as a storyteller or as an entrepreneur, is to pursue those projects. And so I think there's some that I thought were so deeply compelling that where there's almost like a spiritual impulse that I have to do it, or if there's the kind of thing that if I think about it and read about it and it sends shivers down my spine, more than likely if I write it and publish it, it'll send shivers down the spine of readers too.
Yeah. I'm thinking about the Me Too and Black Lives Matter and these many different movements trying to essentially work for social justice, right? Mm-hmm. Is there an analogy in the world of like disability or ailments that has a similar kind of push or following, or is this something that maybe is missing in the social justice conversation, or not nearly as well established or known?
Probably, yeah. I mean, I can think of a couple ways that we're trying to tell that within the ME/CFS population, but that's only about 0.4% of the country. So that's not something that would really be a society-wide issue. But I think it could be that there are these millions missing events that are kind of like virtual sit-ins in a way that we've done in about 100 different cities around the country, around the world, really. And the millions missing refers to millions of dollars missing from research, just as much as it refers to millions of people missing from their lives. So those protests are marked by oftentimes hundreds of shoes in front of hundreds of empty shoes representing the people who are not actually there at the protest. Outside of U.S. Capitol building or a state Capitol building, or some kind of major public place in a lot of European cities as well.
Yeah, and I think it's important. This 0.4% of the population is probably not enough to mobilize popular sentiment, right? So I think
in order
to some conglomeration between different ailments.
There's fibromyalgia or Lyme disease, Gulf War syndrome, a number. Multiple sclerosis is not far. So I think that the bigger umbrella that I think that this fits under is dysautonomia, which describes a range of conditions that are dysfunctions of the autonomic nervous system. So within the work I do with the AMI Action Network, there's a regular discussion about how to ally with kind of a disease adjacent groups.
Yeah, it's important, right? Just to get people behind common threads of importance. It really makes a difference.
To do anything, you have any kind of success in any endeavor, you have to make sure that you're getting rid of these silos that separate people from everybody else, and kind of figure out ways to draw connections and build bridges.
Right. I want to talk about your movie or the documentary Forgotten Plague. Mostly, you are a journalist that is sort of deeply connected to this, right? So, how was that for you, researching almost sort of meta yourself? And was that a strange thing to be working on, or did it just hit home really easily, or how did that interaction go? For you?
I was telling someone a story recently where there was one day when we were I was working with some friends from college on the film, and we built a company and raised hundreds of thousands of dollars from the patient community, and were able to build the production out and travel around the country to do the film. But there's a day when I remember getting off of work and going to the subway, and the guy was asking me, "How's your day going?" I was, "Oh, it's great, just got off work." And then he said, "What do you do for a job?" I'm making a film. What kind of film? Oh, it's a film about a disease. What disease? I tell him the disease. Oh, why are you doing that? And I sort of, within 30 seconds, I'm telling him like this like deep secret that I sort of waited months to tell many people, and then I was getting to the point where I was very openly talking about my story with everybody, and it became probably ultimately became one of the most empowering things I've ever done, and it's really driven quite a bit of the success I've had in my career afterwards. And a lot of the biggest stories I do at CNN are related to the experience that others have of having severe suffering in some way,
right? And
figuring out ways to redeem the suffering. I think that if doing a story that's just depressing on its own, where it's only bad things happen, isn't going to work. But highlighting this heroic journey, this narrative of falling and then getting back up, there's a deep spiritual craving for that, and you see these stories work really well. I wouldn't call them feel-good stories or inspiration stories. They're really like redemption stories is a better way to think about it. And they follow an arc that's, I think, kind of embedded in going back to like the Iliad and the Odyssey.
Yeah. And I think, redemption is so central, like even in the Bible, right? And it's this idea that we all want a second chance because we all mess up somehow, or we all have something that holds us back. So I think it is like a very universal, powerful message to say there's never an end. You can always be redeemed. And I think that's why it's such a powerful message across so many different fields and approaches to telling that story. Yeah,
like suffering is universal, sin is universal, or frailty or fallibility is part of the human condition. So it's going to hit everybody in some different way. And so if you figure out, it's really important, I think, to highlight people who can offer a way to get through it, through discovering a drug, or through researching something, or who leading a movement. There's a lot of power in that type of story, and I think that those do really well for getting a lot of readership.
You mentioned something a minute ago that I wanted to go back to, because I think it's a really interesting point in how much it transformed you to hear people, and maybe I could say normalizing the stories related to your own condition, and how talking with people day in and day out for a long time, I think probably trying to kind of put my own lens on this, it probably really made these conversations seem more normal and seem more obvious that they needed to happen. And so it might, contribute to being able to have that conversation in Subway, or being able to just spout it out more readily and often, and even with dignity and class, because you've had that conversation enough time and heard enough people do it in different ways.
I think when you sort of discuss a certain hardship or vulnerability in your own life in a compelling way, you're kind of unconsciously enabling the other person to unlock that same level of depth in their own self. And if you're sharing in a deep way that, but in a tactful way, I think it's really important to not do it in a way that's oversharing or overburdening somebody.
Yeah.
And some people make that mistake of trying to be radically vulnerable, but doing it in a really inappropriate way. But doing it in a way where you think the other person's ready to hear that kind of sharing, they will oftentimes respond in turn, and it becomes a very powerful way of doing genuine human connection.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sharing our own vulnerability just opens us up more to connection, understanding, and wanting to reciprocate that, just as a social convention, but also it brings people closer together. You share your burden, I share mine. Now we know each other, and we know a little more about like what struggles we face or how we can empathize with each other's experience. It's powerful.
People are usually pretty relieved, I think, to hear that someone else has had something severe happen to them, and you realize that you're not alone,
right?
Despite it being something radically different,
right? And I think that is a huge piece of the human experience, is just shared experience, knowing that we're not alone.
Yeah, I was having a conversation with someone who recently about. He had been one of the first people to work in the White House, and this was in the Obama White House, but he worked, he had been behind bars because of a marijuana conviction for several years. And so he got once he was out of prison, he started working for the Obama campaign and ultimately got a job working in the White House. And I think the president at the time had wanted somebody who had the experience of having been a felon, actually helping guide the nation's policies on some of these areas. And he had a really interesting comment to me that when I was talking to him about the disease that I have, and he said, I understand what you're talking about. I too have an invisible mark against me. I walk around every single day with a felon record, and it affected him in a totally different way than my disease affected me. But I think that was a really powerful example of how to do empathy in a good way.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a neat idea. I mean, it sounds novel to bring a felon in to help work on these issues, but it's really not, right? It's sort of an obvious thing that we should be asking the people who are directly affected and experienced in different areas if we're trying to create policy or other things, right? And I think it's something that's so often overlooked.
With a lot of these prison reform initiatives in general, like just the idea of redemption is kind of one of the most important issues in a prison system, and that people can, they're being punished, but they also do have the human capacity for redemption, and enabling them to be forgiven by society is one thing, but giving them the capacity to be able to forgive themselves might be one of the harder things. Yeah,
especially depending on what brought you there. I mean, there's so many different things that could put people in prison, and sometimes it's like getting in prison for a marijuana conviction is not something you probably need to forgive yourself as much for, because there's so many people in prison for things like that is just a failure of the system to recognize the punishment meeting the crime. And anyway,
disparities in race and class,
right,
as far as the kind of sentencing that happens.
Right. And sadly, even the prison system, even though it should be rehabilitating people, it's generally not the case. At least statistically, we see people just back, and recidivism is a problem, and it shouldn't be that way. But anyway, I love tangents. So we're just taking a tangent here. Okay, so I lost my place in my questions here, but I wanted, the movie, right? Mm-hmm. Just because maybe some of the listeners haven't heard or seen the movie, is there maybe a teaser story you could give us that might make them want to go find it and listen to or watch it?
Yeah, the kind of the core, this is the climax. This is toward the end of it, but I think this is kind of where the emotional heart of the film ultimately gets to. As we're following a journey that begins with my own self and writing about it for USA Today, and then getting in touch with this larger community of tens of thousands of other patients, and realizing that I wanted to be kind of a voice for all of them. It leads to Stanford, and it leads to Ron Davis, who I alluded to earlier. His son is severely ill. He hasn't spoken a word in 10 years, and he can't eat solid food, and he can't really communicate in any particular way. He can sort of do hand gestures, and that's about the most he can do. And so what's really compelling about this story, I think, is that you've got one of the world's greatest scientists working to crack the case, and living under the same roof is one of the most severe patients in the ME/CFS patient population. So, Whitney who's Ron's son, is kind of wasting away, and that is vital. I think just highlighting this constant thing of combining both good and bad in the same story, and then the disease has the capacity to be redeemed or to be cured through the suffering, the kind of sacrificial suffering of a particular person. So I was, thinking about this, and you kind of see Christ figures go. Mr. Daniel, this ninth grade teacher I had, was, they're always trying to read these poems and novels and look for Christ figures. And I think Whitney and Ron were both kind of Christ figures in their own way. Well, Whitney is kind of redeeming this huge population of people through a kind of suffering, and it's very moving, I think, to see Ron, the father, bending down one of the greatest scientists in the world, and he's, washing his son's feet, who's one of the feeblest.
Wow. That does paint a very biblical picture of giving and humble surrender to your situation.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah,
that's powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, well,
and I want to make sure that this is not using the Bible or using it in a way that's like most universalizing, and not in a way that's
That's how
I think people. I don't think people are getting that vibe, but it's really important to. I think that these deep stories that are part of world culture have enduring value for a reason. They're tapping into something truly human.
The stories that endure are the ones that we all can identify with and be inspired by over many generations, and that's why they endure. Right? Yeah, it's powerful. So we're just about out of time. Okay. I really appreciate you coming and making this time, but I'm curious, just from the standpoint of, you've been writing stories for a long time, kind of going through many different people's narratives and trying to get them out into the world. What's the best part about this job for you?
Yeah, every day that you get to talk to somebody really interesting about something, and you publish something that day, and you met someone interesting that you had to interview that day, and it all happened, and you see the process go from an idea to a published piece that sometimes hundreds of thousands of people read. It's kind of addicting because you can see it. You don't really get bored because I tend to change topics.
There's a lot of variety. There's so many different stories. Yeah.
I would go from doing a story on coral reefs to doing a story on horse racing to doing a story about a bill that's being passed in a certain legislature. So it's always changing. We're always moving really fast, and I think we're always getting results.
Then that's powerful, right? When you can see results and you can see the responses, it really is encouraging to keep going, right?
Yeah.
What about the hardest part? What is the most difficult part of the work that you do?
I think there's certain stories, especially crime stories, or stories about natural disasters, or stories about war, that are hard. And I think it goes without saying that my worst days at the office are days when there's mass shootings.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Those are the days when sometimes you get a text message from one of your friends and they say, I'm sorry, you have to go to work today. And they don't work at CNN, and I do, and I know that. If you get a text from someone like that it's going to be the worst day ever. So you have to really kind of psych yourself up to really just sort of endure it. And I think that journalists get a lot of vicarious trauma on some of those stories. So those are the ones that make it. If I was ever to think about leaving, which I don't have any interest in leaving, I think it is really addicting. I love the job a lot. Mm-hmm. But the mass shootings, I think is but that's an American problem. That's not really a journalistic problem.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, it's always tough because your hands are tied and you want to do good work, but in the end of the day, it's just a tragedy.
Yeah, it's a tragedy that has less meaning. I think that natural disasters like hurricanes and earthquakes don't really have any inherent meaning behind them either. They're just they're bad, and that's all it is.
Fact of life, right?
But it's humans doing it to humans, and I think that's what really kind of rips people up. And that doesn't happen quite as much in other countries, but it happens in America.
Yeah. It's really becoming so often these days. I think it's starting to become numbing, right?
Yeah. So that's when, it's definitely tough for, I think, a lot of us to come to work and be a part of that.
Yeah. Sorry to take you down there. Let's
but those are the worst, that's the worst day.
Yeah, absolutely. So you are spending the majority of your time and work trying to create change in the world, right? Mm-hmm. You're telling stories, you're interviewing people. But if I was to hand you a magic wand, what would be like the top 3 things you would actually just want to make change right now, so to make your work easier or to show the success that you've been trying for so long with all this work you're doing? What are maybe the top three things that you
for working with a patient population or working as a journalist? Or
I would let you go any direction you want to go. This is our sort of final question, letting you leave your highest aspirations for what you want to see changed in the world through your journalism work or patient populations. If you could just tap that wand, where would you want to see the biggest changes happening?
I get three things.
You get three. Yeah,
taps.
yeah.
Okay,
this is like a genie in the bottle here.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think that having a capacity for the ME/CFS patients that I try to help, it's having early diagnostic available for everybody and a treatment available for everybody. That's going to take hundreds of millions of dollars and a decade plus to do what should be a simple thing that a lot of people with most diseases would have. So that would definitely require a wand tap.
It's funny because you're asking. I'm offering you magic, and you're asking for funding.
We're asking for the things that funding would accomplish.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Skip the $300 million over 10 years and just get to the result that everybody wants from that money.
Yeah. I guess my point is that money shouldn't be the thing that stops these things from happening, right?
I think, well, there's, Silicon Valley is good at that, figuring out ways to kind of 10x the potential of certain innovators and get around these bureaucratic issues.
Right.
So I've got two more wand taps.
You got two more, yeah.
I would want to... I don't know. I'm kind of drawing a blank. Can you give me a hint on something that
Yeah. Well, how about impact of your stories? Mm-hmm. What would be the ultimate goal if you're writing these stories, how they could impact, if you could take it from let's hope they get the message to I have a magic wand?
Because each story is a separate issue altogether. And, there is a need to tell stories objectively. I would like it... and this might be a nerdy thing to say, but I would like it if the entire population read more. It would benefit me because I would be reading stories by me or by other people. But I think that reading is definitely a better way to get knowledge than through television or some of the other means. And if people read widely and deeply and didn't spend as much time on their smartphone, that would be a very useful thing for
I like
society.
That. Yeah, that's beautiful.
So I got one more.
Yeah, you got one more. Maybe personally or health-wise or anything you want.
I would, for personal goals, I think that, I definitely would like to, I'm not that far away from doing a lot of these things, but, being able to run a marathon is a big, I can run, 3 or 4 miles a few times a week, but being able to work out at a high level and to be more of a higher performance athlete is something that's out of reach right now because of the medical status. And I wanted to be an Army Ranger before I got sick, and that was going to, or getting through boot camp was going to be one thing, getting through Ranger school was going to be quite a bit harder. And so that's kind of a non-starter. But that was a path that I would have been interested in my life taking, and that would have been different from the kind of, I think, interesting arc that I've being humbled and trying to rebuild myself in a more resilient way. And I wouldn't, had I not gotten sick, I would have gone that route. But it's not clear to me that would have been like the most redemptive route. I guess I keep coming to that word as thinking about that a lot.
Well, I can honestly say I am not glad that you've come up with this illness in your life, but I am very glad for the work you've been doing because of it.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you very much, and thank you for making the time to come in.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the invite.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been a real joy to sit down and talk with you. This has been Ryan Pryor, and he's been sitting down with me for the last hour on modern education. We will be back every week, Friday from 3 to 4 p.m. for your commute. Please tune in next week for another interview and some new information for you. And I am the host, Benjamin S. Woodford. I'll be here next week to bring you some more topics.